6 weeks changed everything. Have you ever felt like you were doing everything right in love, but still felt tired, unseen, and quietly lonely? This video is not about perfect English, and it's not about a perfect marriage either. It's about 6 ordinary weeks in the United States that slowly, almost secretly, changed how I love, how I speak, and how I listen. If you're close to giving up, on English, on yourself, or on a relationship, stay with me. This story might sound uncomfortably familiar. 6 weeks ago, I arrived in the US with a suitcase, a marriage, and a quiet belief that love meant endurance. You know that belief. The kind where you think, if I try harder, things will get better. In those first days, everything looked fine from the outside. We woke up together. We cooked together. We planned the future together. But inside, something felt tight, like a knot you keep ignoring because you're afraid to touch it. Living in America does that to you. The silence is different here. People smile, but they don't ask too many questions. The streets are wide. The days are long. And suddenly, you hear your own thoughts much louder. That's when I realized I had been saying yes to everything. Yes to being flexible. Yes to being understanding. Yes to staying quiet when something didn't feel right. In English, there's a simple sentence, I'm fine. I used it a lot. Too much. Maybe you've done that too. Not just in love, but in learning English. You tell yourself, I'm fine. I'll practice later. I don't need to speak today. And slowly, motivation leaks out. Psychology calls this emotional suppression. When you keep pushing feelings down, your brain spends energy hiding them instead of healing them. That's not weakness. That's biology. One evening, about 2 weeks in, my partner asked a very normal question. Nothing dramatic. But my body reacted before my mouth did. My shoulders tightened. My breath went shallow. That's your nervous system talking, by the way. Science says when your body feels unsafe, language becomes harder. That's why learning English feels impossible when you're stressed. It's not laziness. Your brain is just trying to protect you. I wanted to answer calmly. I wanted to be kind. But what came out was silence. And silence, in a relationship, is never empty. It's full of unsaid words. That night, I lay in bed thinking, is this what love is supposed to feel like? Not pain. Just quiet exhaustion. Here's the strange part. The breakthrough didn't come from a big fight or a dramatic conversation. It came from noticing one small truth. Love doesn't require constant agreement. In fact, constant agreement slowly kills intimacy. Researchers on healthy marriages say couples who last are not the ones who avoid conflict, but the ones who feel safe expressing boundaries. At that moment, I didn't know how to say it in perfect English or perfect words. I just knew something had to change. Not tomorrow. Not after I became better. But now. Because growth, whether in language or love, never starts when you feel ready. It starts when staying the same hurts more than changing. So this is where our story really begins. Not with romance. Not with drama. But with awareness. With the quiet understanding that sometimes, strength doesn't look like holding on. Sometimes, it looks like preparing to say one honest word. And that word is coming. Love far from home. Imagine waking up in a place where everything works, but nothing feels familiar. The coffee tastes fine, the roads are clean, the houses stand calmly in the sun, yet your heart feels slightly out of place. That's what love feels like when it leaves home. In these 6 weeks in America, I learned something uncomfortable. Distance doesn't just separate you from family or language, it quietly tests the truth inside your relationship. Back home, love had context. Friends, routines, shared history. In the US, it was just the two of us. No background noise. No emotional safety net. Psychologists call this context collapse. When external support disappears, unresolved issues become louder. And suddenly, every small habit feels bigger. Every silence feels heavier. At first, we tried to stay positive. We told each other, it's just stress. In simple English, we said things like, we're okay. We're just tired. Those sentences sound harmless, but repetition turns them into walls. When you say okay too often, you stop checking if it's true. The brain loves shortcuts, especially emotional ones. I noticed how we started speaking less, not more. Short sentences. Functional words. Like roommates managing a schedule. Love became efficient. And efficiency is useful, but it's not intimacy. Studies on emotional bonding show that connection comes from shared meaning, not shared tasks. Cooking together doesn't help if no one is emotionally present. One afternoon, while doing something very ordinary, folding laundry, I felt a wave of sadness that surprised me. Not anger. Not blame. Just the feeling of being far away while standing right next to someone you love. That feeling has a name, emotional loneliness. It often appears in couples who avoid conflict. Because when you don't disagree, you also stop revealing yourself. This is where English quietly entered our story. When emotions felt too complex in our first language, we switched. Slowly. Carefully. Simple sentences. I feel tired today. I need some space. English gave us distance without coldness. Research shows that using a second language can reduce emotional intensity, helping couples talk without escalating. I didn't know the science then. I just felt safer. But even safety has a cost. If you stay in that calm, shallow zone too long, nothing changes. You feel polite, but stuck. And that's dangerous for love. Because relationships don't break from storms alone. They break from long, quiet droughts. One night, we sat across from each other at a small kitchen table. No phones. No TV. Just tired eyes and a lot of unsaid thoughts. I realized something very clear, being far from home wasn't the problem. Being far from honesty was. Love doesn't need a familiar country. It needs truth. That realization didn't fix anything instantly. But it shifted something inside me. A small internal movement. Like turning your body toward the light, even before you stand up. I began to see that maybe this distance was not here to break us, but to show us where we had been avoiding ourselves. And avoidance, whether in love or language learning, always feels comfortable at first. Until it doesn't. What I didn't know yet was that the next step wouldn't come from explaining more, or trying harder. It would come from risking one small act of courage, one that felt terrifying precisely because it was honest. When silence replaced words. Silence is never loud at first. It sneaks in politely, like a guest who doesn't want to disturb you. In our third week in the US, silence started doing most of the talking. Not the angry kind. The practical kind. The kind that says, let's not make this harder than it already is. We still spoke, of course. About groceries. About schedules. About weather. But none of those words touched anything real. Psychologists call this surface communication. It keeps relationships stable, but not alive. And here's the cruel part, the brain often prefers it, because depth requires risk. I noticed how my sentences got shorter. How I stopped asking open questions. That's a defense mechanism. When you sense tension, your nervous system shifts into protection mode. Language becomes efficient, emotional range shrinks. This is also why, when people feel discouraged learning English, they suddenly forget words they already know. Stress literally narrows access to memory. One morning, I tried to say something important. Not dramatic. Just honest. But my throat tightened. Instead, I said nothing. Silence won. Again. Later that day, I felt oddly guilty, like I had failed a test no one gave me. That guilt wasn't about love. It was about self-betrayal. In marriage research, there's a concept called emotional bidding. These are small attempts to connect, comments, questions, tone changes. When bids are ignored, people stop making them. That's how silence grows. Not from cruelty, but from fatigue. English came back into our lives in an unexpected way. I started writing instead of speaking. Short messages. Clear words. I need time to think. Writing slowed everything down. Just like slow English practice does. When you slow language, you give your brain space to feel without panic. But silence has a strange side effect. It gives you time to hear yourself. And what I heard wasn't anger toward my partner. It was disappointment toward myself. I realized I had been avoiding discomfort by choosing quiet. And quiet was costing me closeness. There's a popular myth about love, that understanding should be automatic. That if you really care, you shouldn't need to explain. Science disagrees. Understanding is not a feeling. It's a skill. And skills require practice of spoken, repeated, sometimes awkward practice. That night, I sat with a simple thought. If I can practice English out loud, imperfectly, why am I afraid to practice honesty the same way? Both feel exposing. Both trigger fear of judgment. And both are the only way forward. Silence, I learned, is not the absence of words. It's the absence of permission to be messy, to be wrong, to be real. And love, like language, cannot survive long in that environment. I didn't break the silence that day. But I stopped trusting it. And that small shift mattered. Because the moment you stop believing silence is safe, you start searching for a different kind of courage. One that doesn't shout. One that doesn't accuse. One that simply tells the truth. Saying yes too often. There's a strange comfort in saying yes. It keeps the room calm. It keeps faces relaxed. It tells everyone, don't worry, I've got this. In our 4th week in the US, I realized how deeply that habit had rooted itself in me. Not just in love, but in how I survived uncertainty. I said yes when I was tired. Yes when I disagreed. Yes when my body was asking for rest. Neuroscience explains this as people-pleasing stress response. When the brain senses potential conflict, it sometimes chooses compliance over expression. The reward is short-term peace. The cost is long-term resentment. The problem with constant agreement is that it teaches others how to treat you, without them even knowing. Love becomes unbalanced quietly. Not because someone is cruel, but because you've removed friction. And friction, oddly enough, is how relationships generate warmth. I noticed how my energy dropped. How English practice felt heavier. There's a connection here. Studies show emotional suppression increases cognitive load. Your brain is busy holding things in. That leaves less space for memory, focus, and language. So when you think you're bad at English, you might just be emotionally exhausted. One evening, my partner asked for something small. Normally, I would say yes automatically. That reflex rose in me again. But this time, something paused. A microsecond of awareness. I heard my own inner voice say, if you say yes, you'll disappear a little more. So I didn't answer right away. That pause felt terrifying. Silence with intention feels different from silence with fear. I took a breath. In slow, simple English, I said, I don't think I can do that today. My voice didn't shake. My heart did. Nothing exploded. The world didn't end. The room stayed standing. That was the shock. All the fear had been theoretical. My nervous system had been predicting danger that never arrived. Psychologists call this corrective emotional experience. When your brain expects rejection but receives neutrality, or even understanding, it rewires. That moment was small, but it mattered. Because for the first time in weeks, I felt present instead of helpful. Saying yes had made me useful. Saying no made me visible. This is where the message matters for you, too. In language learning, we often say yes to unrealistic expectations. Yes to speed. Yes to perfection. Yes to comparing ourselves to others. And slowly, we burn out. Progress doesn't require more effort. It requires better boundaries. That night, the air between us felt different. Not warmer. Clearer. Like opening a window instead of turning up the heat. Love didn't shrink. It adjusted. And adjustment, I learned, is not failure. It's intelligence. I went to sleep with an unfamiliar feeling, not relief, not guilt, but something calmer. Self-respect. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It just sits there, steady, waiting for you to notice. That was the moment I understood. strength isn't about endurance. It's about honesty with timing. The first honest no. The first honest no never sounds powerful. It sounds small. Almost awkward. Like you're testing a word that hasn't lived in your mouth before. In week 5, that word finally came out of mine, and it changed the emotional temperature of everything. What surprised me wasn't the word itself, but how my body reacted afterward. My shoulders dropped. My breathing slowed. According to psychology, this is your parasympathetic nervous system activating, the part responsible for safety and calm. In simple terms, my body felt relieved because my words finally matched my truth. We often think honesty creates conflict. Research shows the opposite. Suppressed needs create tension, expressed needs create clarity. When I said no, gently and without defense, the conversation didn't escalate. It softened. My partner asked questions. Real ones. Not to argue, but to understand. English helped here in an unexpected way. Using simple sentences forced me to be clear. No extra emotion. No long explanations. Just, I need rest tonight. I feel overwhelmed. Clarity reduced misunderstanding. This is why slow English is powerful, not just for learning, but for connection. There's a concept in relationship science called emotional congruence. It means your inner state aligns with your outer expression. When they don't match, anxiety increases. When they do, even difficult conversations feel manageable. That night, I felt congruent for the first time in weeks. Something else happened, too. Respect appeared. Quietly. Not dramatic. But real. Because boundaries don't push people away, they tell them where to stand. I realized I had been confusing love with self-erasure. Many of us do. Especially when we're afraid of losing something. But love built on fear is fragile. Love built on truth can bend without breaking. This lesson echoed into my English practice. I stopped forcing long sessions. I said no to guilt. I practiced 10 minutes, fully present. Science backs this up. Short, focused practice creates stronger neural pathways than long, stressed sessions. Progress accelerated the moment pressure left. The irony is this, the more honest I became, the more connection I felt. With my partner. With myself. With the language I was learning. Saying no didn't close doors. It organized them. That night, before sleeping, my partner said something simple. Thank you for telling me. Not sorry. Not okay. Thank you. That's what honesty invites. The first honest no didn't solve everything. But it set a standard. And standards, unlike sacrifices, don't drain you. They guide you. And once you feel that guidance, going back to silence becomes impossible. English between us. It's funny how language finds its way into the most emotional moments, even when you didn't invite it. By the 6th week, English had quietly become our neutral ground. Not a subject to study. Not a goal to achieve. Just a tool to breathe through difficult feelings without hurting each other. When emotions run high, your first language carries too much history. Every word is loaded. English, for us, felt lighter. Simpler. When I said, "I feel tired," it didn't sound dramatic. It sounded factual. And facts are easier to sit with than accusations. Linguists call this emotional distancing through second language use. It reduces emotional intensity and helps the brain stay regulated. We started doing this naturally. During sensitive conversations, we slowed down. Short sentences. Clear pauses. No idioms. No sarcasm. That pace mattered. Neuroscience shows the brain processes slow speech more deeply, especially under stress. That's why slow English isn't just good for learners, it's good for humans. I noticed something else. When we spoke English, we listened more carefully. Maybe because we both knew mistakes were allowed. There was less ego. Less need to be right. In relationships, perceived equality increases safety. And safety is where honesty grows. This changed how I felt about English practice. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was presence. I started reading simple texts out loud. Not to sound fluent, but to feel grounded. My brain stopped associating English with pressure and started linking it with calm conversations and real connection. There's research showing that learning in emotionally safe contexts improves retention. Your brain remembers what doesn't threaten it. That's why drilling vocabulary while stressed rarely works. But learning words tied to real feelings? That sticks. One evening, we talked about the future. Slowly. In English. No big promises. Just shared thoughts. And I realized something profound. Language doesn't heal relationships. But it can create the space where healing becomes possible. English wasn't fixing us. It was giving us room to fix ourselves. And maybe that's the point of learning any language, not to impress, but to connect. Not to sound perfect, but to be understood. That night, I felt closer than I had in weeks. Not because everything was solved, but because nothing was hidden. And when nothing is hidden, love can finally breathe. Why boundaries feel scary? Boundaries sound calm in theory, but in real life, they trigger fear. Not because they're harmful, but because they threaten old survival patterns. In week 7, emotionally speaking, I realized why saying no had felt so dangerous. My brain wasn't afraid of conflict. It was afraid of abandonment. Psychology explains this through attachment theory. If you learned early that love meant adapting, pleasing, or staying quiet, your nervous system associates boundaries with loss. So when you set one, your body reacts as if something precious is about to disappear, even when it's not. That fear showed up physically. Faster heartbeat. Tight chest. Overthinking simple conversations. This is the same response many people feel when speaking English out loud. Fear of being judged activates the amygdala, reducing access to language centers. That's why words vanish under pressure. Understanding this changed everything. The fear wasn't a sign I was wrong. It was a sign I was doing something new. Boundaries aren't walls. They're instructions. They tell others how to love you without hurting you. When I stopped explaining them excessively, they became clearer. Short sentences. Calm tone. Consistency. Science shows clarity reduces anxiety on both sides. What surprised me most was the result. Love didn't withdraw. It adjusted. My partner didn't feel rejected. They felt informed. That's the difference between avoidance and honesty. Avoidance confuses. Honesty organizes. This insight also transformed my approach to learning. I stopped comparing myself to fluent speakers. Comparison is a boundary violation against yourself. I practiced at my own pace. 10 calm minutes beat 1 hour of self-criticism. The brain learns best when it feels safe, not rushed. That's neuroscience, not motivation talk. Once I saw fear as a signal, not a stop sign, everything softened. Boundaries stopped feeling selfish. They started feeling necessary. And necessary things, when respected, build trust. That week, love felt quieter, but stronger. Like a house after renovation. Less clutter. More structure. Fear didn't disappear. But it stopped controlling my decisions. And that's when boundaries stopped being scary and started being freeing. Marriage is not constant agreement. There's a quiet lie many of us carry into marriage without realizing it. The lie says, if we love each other enough, we won't disagree. Or worse, if we disagree, something must be wrong. In these weeks in America, that belief slowly collapsed for me, not in a dramatic argument, but in a series of small, honest moments that felt surprisingly calm. Agreement feels safe. It keeps conversations short. It avoids awkward pauses. Your nervous system loves it because there's no threat. But psychology tells a different story. Research on long-term relationships shows that couples who last are not those who agree most, but those who repair well after disagreement. Conflict itself doesn't predict divorce. Avoidance does. I started noticing a pattern in myself. Whenever my partner shared an opinion, my first instinct was alignment. Not because I fully agreed, but because disagreement felt risky. My brain associated difference with distance. That's an old survival program. When the brain senses potential disconnection, it pushes you toward sameness. Just agree. Stay close. But closeness built on erasing yourself is fragile. It looks peaceful, but it's hollow. One evening, a small disagreement came up. Nothing dramatic. But instead of nodding automatically, I paused. That pause mattered. It gave my prefrontal cortex time to engage, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning and language. Under stress, this part often shuts down. That's why we either snap or go silent. I spoke slowly. Simple words. I understand you. I see it differently. No blaming. No long explanations. Just presence. The room didn't tense. It softened. That surprised me. Marriage therapists often talk about differentiation, the ability to stay emotionally connected while holding your own perspective. It's a skill, not a personality trait. And like any skill, it improves with practice. The first attempts feel clumsy. But they matter. This lesson hit me again when practicing English. When learners only repeat safe phrases, progress stalls. Fluency grows when you risk saying something slightly wrong. Marriage works the same way. Intimacy grows when you risk being slightly misunderstood and stay anyway. That disagreement didn't end with a winner. It ended with understanding. We didn't fully agree, but we stayed connected. That's the point. Agreement isn't intimacy. Presence is. I also noticed something subtle but important. After I stopped forcing agreement, my partner listened more carefully. Not because I spoke louder, but because I spoke truthfully. Authenticity commands attention without demanding it. Over time, these moments changed the emotional climate of our home. Conversations felt slower, deeper, less scripted. We weren't trying to protect the relationship anymore. We were participating in it. There's a scientific reason this works. When both people feel psychologically safe, the brain releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone. Safety doesn't come from sameness. It comes from predictability and respect. Boundaries create that predictability. Marriage, I learned, is not a performance of harmony. It's a practice of honesty. Quiet, consistent honesty. And once you feel that, constant agreement stops feeling loving. It starts feeling unnecessary. Love doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to stay fully. Guilt, love, and choice. Guilt has a soft voice. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It sounds like responsibility. Like kindness. Like love. In week 9 of this emotional journey, I realized guilt had been quietly steering many of my choices, especially the ones I thought I was making for us. When I said no more often, guilt appeared immediately. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I had broken an old pattern. Psychology explains this as conditioned guilt. When your identity has been shaped around being agreeable, self-sacrifice feels moral, even when it hurts you. I noticed how my mind tried to correct me. Maybe you're being selfish. Maybe you should have tried harder. These thoughts feel personal, but they're actually automatic. The brain is trying to restore the familiar. Familiar feels safe, even if it's unhealthy. This is where love gets confusing. We often mix up love with obligation. But obligation is driven by fear, fear of disappointing, fear of being replaced, fear of being too much. Love, real love, allows choice. Choice is what makes affection meaningful. Without choice, there is only duty. One night, after setting a boundary, I sat with the guilt instead of acting on it. That was new. Normally, I would rush to fix it, apologize, over-explain, take the no back. But neuroscience says emotions peak and fall if you don't reinforce them. Guilt, like a wave, passes when you stop feeding it. I reminded myself of something simple. In English, feeling guilty doesn't mean I'm wrong. Saying that out loud helped. Language shapes perception. When you name an emotion, the brain's threat response decreases. This is called affect labeling. It's scientifically proven to reduce emotional intensity. Slow English became a tool again. Short sentences. Clear meaning. I wasn't arguing with myself. I was grounding myself. What surprised me most was how love responded. My partner didn't pull away. There was no punishment. No cold distance. The guilt had predicted loss, but loss never came. That's another corrective experience. Each time fear is disproven, it weakens. I started seeing guilt differently. Not as a warning, but as a signpost. It pointed to growth. To moments where I was choosing consciously instead of reacting automatically. This changed how I approached English learning, too. I stopped feeling guilty for not studying enough. Enough is a moving target. Consistency matters more than volume. Research confirms that emotional self-compassion improves learning outcomes. Beating yourself up slows progress. Love works the same way. Harshness doesn't create closeness. Compassion does. By the end of that week, guilt still appeared, but it no longer controlled my decisions. It became background noise, not a command. And that's when I understood something important. Love that depends on guilt is fragile. Love that survives choice is strong. Learning English through emotions. For a long time, I believed the same thing many people believe, that learning English fails because we're not disciplined enough. Not smart enough. Not consistent enough. But 6 weeks into this emotional journey in the US, I realized something far more uncomfortable and far more hopeful. English wasn't the problem. My emotional state was. When my relationship felt heavy, English felt heavy too. Listening became exhausting. Speaking felt risky. Even familiar words seemed to disappear. This isn't imagination. Neuroscience explains it clearly. Emotional stress activates the brain's threat system, pulling resources away from the areas responsible for language and memory. In simple terms, when your heart feels unsafe, your brain stops learning efficiently. That's why forcing yourself to study when you're emotionally drained rarely works. You sit there, listening to audio, repeating sentences, but nothing sticks. And then guilt appears. Why am I so bad at this? That guilt adds more stress, and the cycle tightens. I saw this pattern clearly during the difficult moments in my marriage. On days when conversations felt tense or unresolved, I couldn't focus on English at all. But on days when we spoke honestly, slowly, calmly, something shifted. English didn't feel like a task. It felt like a companion. I began changing one small thing. Instead of practicing English as a separate activity, I practiced it through my emotions. I used words that matched how I felt. Simple ones. I feel tired today. I feel more calm now. I need time. Emotional relevance matters. Studies show that the brain retains information better when it's emotionally meaningful. Stories are remembered. Lists are forgotten. I also slowed everything down. Slower listening. Slower speaking. Longer pauses. Silence became part of the practice. Silence gives the brain time to process, to connect sound with meaning. This is especially important for adult learners. Speed impresses. Slowness builds. Another important shift happened when I stopped judging my mistakes. In relationships, Judgment creates distance. In learning, it does the same. Self-criticism activates the same neural pathways as external criticism. Your brain doesn't care who's attacking, it just reacts. So I practiced self-compassion deliberately. 10 minutes a day. Fully present. No phone. No multitasking. Research confirms that short, focused, emotionally safe practice creates stronger neural connections than long, distracted sessions. Less time. More depth. English stopped being something I had to catch up with. It became something that reflected my inner state. When I felt calm, English flowed. When I felt tense, I rested. Rest is part of learning. That's biology, not laziness. And here's the quiet truth most people never hear. You don't learn a language by pushing harder. You learn it by making space. Space in your schedule. Space in your emotions. Space to be imperfect. In the end, English didn't save my relationship. But my relationship taught me how to learn English. Through honesty. Through gentleness. Through patience. When learning is connected to life, it stops feeling foreign. It starts feeling human. A softer home, a clearer voice. There's a moment you don't notice at first, when a home shifts from feeling tense to feeling safe. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small details, how you breathe when you open the door, how long silence lasts before it feels awkward, how your body rests instead of bracing. By the end of these 6 weeks in the US, our home felt different. Not because problems disappeared, but because pressure did. When honesty became normal, tension lost its job. What changed most wasn't the topics we talked about, but the pace. Conversations slowed. We left space between sentences. Neuroscience explains why this matters. Slower interactions allow the nervous system to regulate. When people feel emotionally safe, the brain shifts out of survival mode. Cortisol drops. Listening improves. Memory sharpens. That safety changed my voice. Literally. I spoke more slowly. More steadily. In English and in my first language. When you're not afraid of being cut off or misunderstood, your voice settles into its natural rhythm. Clarity isn't something you force. It emerges when fear leaves. I noticed how English started to feel different in my mouth. Softer. Less tense. I didn't rush to fill silence. Silence became thinking time, not failure. Linguists note that fluency isn't about speed, it's about flow. And flow only happens when the speaker feels safe. This carried into everyday moments. Ordering coffee. Asking simple questions. Saying no politely. Small interactions stopped draining me. That's because emotional labor decreased at home. When your primary relationship is stable, your brain has more capacity for the world. There's solid science behind this. Emotional security in close relationships is linked to improved cognitive performance. When the brain isn't constantly scanning for relational danger, it reallocates resources to learning, creativity, and language. Our home didn't become quieter. It became truer. We laughed more, not because life was easier, but because pretending stopped. Pretending is exhausting. Honesty is efficient. I also noticed a subtle but important shift. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head before speaking. That rehearsal was anxiety, not preparation. Once anxiety eased, words came naturally. Imperfect, but real. A clearer voice isn't about confidence. It's about permission. Permission to pause. Permission to choose words slowly. Permission to exist without apologizing. This is why learning English in isolation often fails. Language grows best in environments where you feel emotionally supported. You don't just learn words. You learn courage. By the end of these weeks, I understood something deeply. A softer home doesn't make you weaker. It makes you audible, to others and to yourself. And once you can hear yourself clearly, you stop speaking just to please. You start speaking to connect. What love needs you to refuse? If you take nothing else from these 6 weeks, take this question with you. What does your love need you to refuse? Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just honestly. Because every meaningful yes in life is protected by a quiet no somewhere nearby. By the end of my time in the US, I realized love hadn't asked me to become stronger. It had asked me to become clearer. Clear about my limits. Clear about my needs. Clear about what I could give without disappearing. We often think refusal is rejection. Psychology says otherwise. Refusal is information. It tells the people who love you how to stay close without causing harm. Without it, they guess. And guessing creates distance. I had refused rest. Refused slowness. Refused my own voice. And love suffered because of it. Not because anyone intended harm, but because unspoken needs always leak out, through exhaustion, resentment, or silence. This applies directly to learning English too. Many people quit not because English is hard, but because they refuse themselves patience. They say no to rest and yes to pressure. But language, like love, doesn't grow under force. It grows under care. When I started refusing unrealistic expectations, progress returned. When I refused guilt, motivation stabilized. When I refused silence, connection deepened. Science backs this up. Sustainable change doesn't come from intensity. It comes from consistency supported by emotional safety. The nervous system learns best when it trusts the environment. That's true in classrooms, in relationships, and in your own mind. So I want you to ask yourself, gently, what are you saying yes to that is slowly draining you? And what would happen if you said no, just once, calmly, without explanation? That no doesn't end love. It defines it. 6 weeks ago, I thought love meant holding on tighter. Now I know it means standing more honestly. And standing honestly didn't push love away. It invited it closer. English didn't magically become easy. Marriage didn't become perfect. Life didn't simplify. But everything became more aligned. Words matched feelings. Actions matched values. And that alignment is where peace lives. If you're tired of learning, of loving, of trying, maybe you don't need more effort. Maybe you need one clean refusal. Refuse to abandon yourself. Because the strongest relationships aren't built on endless sacrifice. They're built on mutual clarity. And clarity, once you taste it, changes everything. Before you leave this video, I want you to pause for a second. Not to remember every word. Not to replay the story perfectly. Just ask yourself one honest question. What is one thing I need to say no to, so I don't lose myself anymore? You don't need a big decision today. You don't need perfect English. You just need awareness. If this story felt slow, real, and close to your heart, that's intentional. Because language learning and love both grow best when you feel safe. If you're learning English, but you're tired of pressure. If you're loving someone, but forgetting yourself. You're not alone. And this channel is for you. If this video helped you even a little, please like the video so YouTube knows this story matters. Comment one word you're learning to say no to. Subscribe for more slow, real English stories about life, love, and healing. New videos are coming, same calm pace, real stories, real English, no rush. Take care of your heart. Your English will follow.